Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander.
Sam, great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan. I'm excited to be here.
Likewise. And we were just chatting before I threw on the recorder and have some interesting connections. Went to the same high school in Northern Virginia.
Yes, we did.
Next to the CIA base, which was interesting.
Yes, we did.
As a random aside that might bore people, but I remember there would be funny things that would happen, and you'd hear stories like there's a delivery guy that tried to ram the door out of frustration, and then the CIA swarmed his delivery van and stuff like that. So
every time you watch a movie and they're like at Langley, and I'm like, but they don't mean my high school. They mean Central Intelligence.
Yeah, exactly. Which shared a weird border, I think, with CIA property. But
yeah.
But anyway, I digress. I guess to start things out, for those of you that you have a really interesting background and started reading your book, and I really appreciated the vulnerability that you opened with there and everything like that. But for those that don't know you, do you mind talking high level, kind of what you're up to and how you
sure.
come at this? Yeah.
My name's Sam. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Pavilion. Pavilion is a global membership organization primarily for revenue executives, people that are focused on customer-facing roles and positions, and CEOs and founders. So people that are building their own businesses that want to go deeper on how to sell, how to market, how to build a business. We've created a membership organization. It's 10,000 people all over the world. The purpose of the organization is to help people navigate their careers more effectively, whether you're an agency owner, whether you're a founder of a startup, whether you're a VP of sales or a VP of marketing at a startup or a high growth company. What we want to do is give you the skills that you need to be great at your job. We want to give you the connections that you need through community, and we want to give you the insights that you need through research and benchmarking reports and data to help you make better, more effective decisions so that you can get where you want to go in your career. So that's what I do during the day. I've been doing it for full time for 5 years. Prior to that, I was a VP of sales and a chief revenue officer at high growth companies in New York since 2003. So for 20 years now. And then I also wrote a book. I wrote a book last year. It's called Kind Folks Finish First, The Considerate Path to Success in Business and Life, which is the book you're referring to, Dan. And the premise of the book is really an articulation and a point of view that there's a different way to do business that is focused on relationships, not transactions, on the long term versus the short term, on giving before you ask for something, and for not trying to chisel people out of every last cent, but really trying to play a long game that sort of is predicated, I guess, fundamentally on karma, but also on compassion and a sense of decency and humanity. And the idea there is it's a way to win, it's a way to compete, and it's a way to separate yourself from everybody else that is short-term focused and transactional. So I wrote that book because it really underscores the ethos and the values that we're trying to build Pavilion around. But, most of my time is spent building this community and this company that is called Pavilion. It's about 10,000 people all over the world that started in New York, and that's what I do.
Yeah, that's awesome. And there's so many places to go with that. I think I often like to kind of do a "this is your life" format for the show and that kind of thing. So you don't have to go through everything, but would you mind talking about those VP of sales roles and what you were doing and how you kind of ended up in those roles? Like I remember almost falling into a sales position at a creative agency, basically, and then finally, my boss got us a sales coach, and he kind of like almost like shook us metaphorically by the shoulders and was like, "Hey, guess what? You're a salesperson, and it might not have been what you planned, but this is where you're at now, and you need to learn how it works," right? And then kind of took ownership of it and so on. But I'd love to learn about your experience with that.
Yeah, I think my journey is somewhat similar. Sales is not, if you come from any kind of privileged background, and I guess I could say I come from a privileged background, right? When I went to UVA, people were routing us in two directions. They were routing us towards strategy consulting and to work for Bain and McKinsey, and they were routing us towards investment banking. And this was over 20 years ago. This is a long time ago. But the point is that, and where I went in undergrad, the commerce school, the comm school, which is like their undergraduate business school, they don't even use the word sales. They almost find it to be like a bad word, like a 4-letter word. It is a 5-letter word. And so I went to work at this company called GLG, Gerson Lehrman Group, and was doing really well. And I was there for 7.5 years, and it was so successful and so productive that it never became clear to me what my job was. And I had all these different job titles that were really mapped to the job titles of a global investment bank. So at one point I was head of research, even though we really didn't do any research. We connected people to other people to answer questions. It wasn't really original research. But I came out of there in 2010, and I realized that if you wanted to work in a software company or really most companies, and you want to be in a position of seniority and influence, there's a kind of two basic roles. You either are building the product or you're selling the product fundamentally. And so I had never thought of myself as a salesperson, and I rechristened myself a salesperson 13 years ago. And it doesn't mean I'd never done sales before, sort of to the point of what you're talking about, Dan, somebody shaking you metaphorically. It's more the realization you are in sales, which is, Dan Pink's book, To Sell is Human. We're all in sales, whether we like it or not, whether you think you have a good perception of it or not. Without sales, without people agreeing to give you their money for the value you're going to deliver, there's no business and there's no commerce and there's no economy. So I rechristened and refashioned myself a salesperson. It turns out I was actually reasonably good at it. And so from there, beginning in about 2010, I became a VP of sales at these venture capital backed companies. And I realized a couple of things. When you're younger, in many ways, the early part of your career is a lot easier than the later part of your career, because the early part of your career, you just work really, really hard. You do more than what they ask you. And I know that might trigger some, well, if you're talking to agency owners on this podcast, maybe not, because they're small business owners that are used to working their asses off. But for Gen Z people, saying do more than you're asked to is somehow offensive and profane at this point in the trajectory of modern society. And you should only do what you're asked. That's what quiet quitting is all about. But regardless, the early part of your career, it's just about working your butt off. And if you do that, you can rise up pretty quickly. You get to the higher parts of your career, the executive portions of your career, when you're in charge of stuff, and all of a sudden the playbooks disappear. There's nobody to tell you how to do it. In fact, you're supposed to know how to do it. And if you don't have resources, if you don't have friends that you can ask, how did you do this thing? And how did you do that thing? Then you're kind of making it up on your own. It's not that you're going to be wrong. You might be wrong sometimes, but mainly it's going to be expensive. It's the most expensive way to do it is to always do it the hardest possible way and take no shortcuts, because you're not referencing people that have walked in that path before. And so that's what happened. I got into these senior roles. I was okay, but not great. And I didn't have all of the answers. The world was changing pretty rapidly. The function and the disciplines of sales and marketing are changing pretty rapidly, even to this day, especially today with AI. And so the consequence of that is that I needed a peer group to help me, because it wasn't just that I didn't know exactly what I was supposed to do, or I could try things, but I didn't have a ton of confidence. It was also I was starting to get fired. The other thing that happens as you get more seniors, or at least my expectation was that my life would become more stable the more senior I got. And what happened was that's not what happened. It became less stable. It became more volatile and more uncertain. And I started getting fired, and I worked at GLG for 7.5 years. And then I worked at the new place for 4.5 years. And then I worked at the next place for 18 months. And then I worked at the next place for 9 months, and the next place for 10 months. And listen, I'm a difficult person and probably not the best number 2 or number 3 in a company. I'm probably better as a number 1 as a CEO. So it's definitely, I'm taking my share of the responsibility here. I'm a pain in the ass, but at the same time, it wasn't just me. That's what I realized. The average lifespan of a sales executive at a high growth company is 18 months. And that's not very long. And so that's why I built Pavilion, because I needed a peer group. I needed a support group. I needed a group of people to help me figure out how to do this. And so I was in all of these jobs as increasingly senior positions with the titles and stuff like that. And I felt less safe, less secure, and more anxious than I had 10 years prior, when I was just an entry-level person, but I was just working really, really hard, and I was rising up through the ranks. So that's a little bit about my background. Just like everybody, kind of like an accidental salesperson, an accidental sales leader that, like you, Dan, came to embrace it.
Yeah, that's great. And kind of reading your book, it sounds like you started in an entrepreneurial role, kind of like playing in bands and so on, and then moved on to working with startups, kind of like having your finger on the pulse of entrepreneurship, and then starting your own thing with Pavilion. What did that feel like? Like, did it actually feel like that was the first big entrepreneurial endeavor? Or what did it take for you to finally realize, like, I don't want to be a number 2, I need to do my own thing? Was there a moment, or how did that play out?
Yeah, there was a moment, and that's the book begins in that moment. So the moment was Friday the 13th, October 2017. And I was going down to my buddy's wedding in DC. He's from Radford, but we both went to UVA together, and he lives in Arlington. So these are Virginia references for me and Dan. And we were on the New Jersey Turnpike, me and my wife and my dog. And I was using, this was before Apple CarPlay was ubiquitous. So I was using my phone as like GPS and using it for Waze. And I got a little notification as I'm using it for GPS that is an email from my CEO at the time. And I so we go over to, whatever the, Walt Whitman rest stop or the Dan Graziano rest stop or whatever, whatever.
The worst rest stops, by the way, are those Jersey
Yeah,
rest stops.
exactly.
Yeah.
Especially because they've gotten rid of a lot of the Roy Rogers, which was like my old stomping
Yeah.
grounds. But so we pull over and I read the email that comes in from my boss, and it's very terse, and it says, I didn't realize you were going to be out today. Can we meet first thing Monday morning? And there was sort of I didn't realize you were going to be out today, which is passive aggressive, of course. And then can we meet first thing Monday morning? And this was a woman that, most of her meetings are at 10:30 or 11. She is not an early morning person, which is fine. I'm not an early morning person either these days, so I don't begrudge her that. But I knew that if she's asking for a first thing Monday morning meeting, it was because I was getting fired. And so I'd been at this company 9 months. I'd started in February. They spent 6 months recruiting me, and I'd been there for 9 months. So, it was roughly equivalent the amount of time they spent trying to get me to work there as the time that I actually did work there. And so at that moment, it was a resolution in my mind. It was a resolution in my mind that I was not going to use this as a sort of a period of wallowing. I wasn't going to feel sorry for myself. There was going to be no pity. I didn't need to take any time off. I didn't need to nurse my wounds. I resolved I was going to use this as an opportunity to build my own business. And it wasn't just Pavilion at the time. What I really did was I started a consulting business, and I decided to start charging for Pavilion because it had been a free community before. And I sold my first sponsorship. And basically what I said was, I'm going to make my own money. I'm going to find a way to make my own money because I cannot give my life and my livelihood and my future to all of these other people. It's just not working. And sometimes people say starting your own business is risky. And I always say the riskiest thing I ever did was go into work every day, feeling eyes on me, feeling like I wasn't really being accepted, that I was at odds with my boss, and that, and especially at that last company, that every decision I made, there would be 3 people scurrying in the background, whispering to the CEO saying that they didn't like what I was doing. And so for me, this was the least risky thing. And I knew that I had my backdated commission, and I knew that I had my severance that I had pre-negotiated. And I used that as a launching pad to build a consulting business first and foremost, and then to build Pavilion. And the point of it the whole time, and I worked one more place before I started working on Pavilion full time during 2018. But the deal that I got, because I really didn't want to work at that place, the deal that I got to work at that place in 2018 was so lucrative and so protected against so many dimensions. It was a very good couple of months because I set myself up. But so the answer to your question is, it was sort of like I didn't really have a choice. It was becoming clear that I wasn't very good at working for other people. And it was also, it became clear it was the least risky thing. And the hardest part was just taking the leap. The hardest part was saying, I'm not going to have a backup plan. My backup plan is I'm going to make money doing my own thing. Yeah. And I will tell you that, and other people have shared this, other consultants, or I don't know if you've ever been on that, but we went to one of my very, very favorite vacations was that winter, because I'd started the consulting business, but I'd wound down on a few projects. I had another client lined up for when I got back in January, and me and my wife and my dog went out to Laguna Beach, Laguna Niguel in Southern California. And so I had money and I had nothing to do. But I knew that more money was coming because I had my next client lined up for January of 2018. And I just remember being so happy and so content that everything was peaceful and fine and only upside. And so at any rate, that's the story of how I got into all of this. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, we raised $25 million 2 years ago. At that point, the company was worth close to $100 million. We've grown 5x since we did that, but valuations have also collapsed. So maybe we're worth just what we raised at 2 years ago. But the point is that I never had, this was not the grand ambition. The grand ambition was not to try and build some world conquering company. The grand ambition was I wanted to run a company that was profitable, that I couldn't be fired from. And I didn't have, it was only, I had given up on sort of chasing, especially because, Dan, you and me live in New York City, where money rules all and where competition rules all, and where you always feel like, you're competing against the person to the right and to the left of you. And I'd finally given up on that. I'd finally said, you know what, I'm not going to work at a hedge fund. I don't know that I'm going to be Steve Cohen or Dan Loeb or whatever. But I'm going to do my thing and I'm going to be happy. And the funny thing is, when I finally let go of all of that, that's when greater success arrived.
Yeah, and I'm sure that wasn't a coincidence. And there's a bunch of things you said that I think are super, super interesting. One is about the perception of risk. And I think that, we're still kind of like living in the shadow of whatever the previous generations, where somebody would work in a job for 30 years and they really would be more secure. And that might have just been an aberration. That might have just been periodic. And I think there's this line I remember, I think it's from like Taleb, where he talks about how if you train with a trainer and they drop a medicine ball on you and you practice throwing it back to them over and over again, and you increase the weight, eventually you could drop a car on yourself and push it back up again. But if you drop the car on yourself without building that muscle, then it's going to crush you. And I sort of feel like, and you might be experiencing this with people in your peer group and newer employees, Gen Zers and stuff, but that's becoming the actual perception of risk, which is like, hey, working in a job is not much more or less risky than doing your own thing. It's just kind of depends on what you want. To shift gears a little bit to peer groups, I think it's interesting because I've had a really great relationship with a peer group called Dynamite Circle, which some listeners might know, location independent entrepreneurship. And that's and I don't know what I would have done without it in kind of the early days of starting Sales Schema in this business. And then it's always been there. And then I've just noticed that at certain key junctures, I'll crave that again, and I'll crave kind of like, I need new ideas. I'm stuck in a local optimum. I think that that's a big thing that peer groups are for. Can you talk a bit about how you started Pavilion and just kind of like what was the origin of that, and how the hell do you bootstrap that to 10,000 people?
I mean, it's the same. These community-based membership organizations are pretty old. There's YPO, Young Presidents Org, there's EO, Entrepreneurs Org, there's Vistage, there's a million different. And it's like my dad says that whether it's your priest, your rabbi, your therapist, or your buddy, or your bartender, talk therapy is generally effective. And across a number, whatever the format is, talking to other people about what you're going through is generally a helpful thing, and humans crave it and they benefit from it. And so I just started bringing people together back in 2014 for dinners, and we do dinner every quarter. And we would talk about our challenges. We would talk about the problems we were working on, and we formed bonds. And it never was intended to be some kind of huge thing, but there's a couple of things that we did that were the first thing I would say is that community unto itself for no other purpose might be interesting. It might be useful, but they're better when they have a point of view. And I had a point of view, and my point of view was about empowering the non-CEO executive. Now we allow, and we have, and some of my best friends are all CEOs now because that's the peer group I'm in through Pavilion. I'm in the CEO Pavilion. But we started off really as the defender of the VP of sales, the VP of marketing, the VP of customer success, the people that were getting fired, that were having trouble and difficulty. And we were teaching them not just how to be good at their job, but how to negotiate. And we were teaching people things about money that are often not discussed. And it became a place where you could ask questions that you couldn't Google the answer to. So the first thing is we had a point of view on the world. And we thought, if we're all going to work places 18 months, that might be the right amount of time, but we're going to need to protect ourselves. And I can't tell you how many executives and members that I talk to every day and every week that are like, just got fired, but I got my 3-month severance. I thought to ask for that. Thanks to Pavilion. You all taught me that. So one part of it is a point of view. The second part of it is, and again, these things aren't like hard to create. Anybody can create a community tomorrow if you just band together a couple of friends and figure out what you stand for. But the second part of it was really this kind of chapter franchise model and going out to leaders in local communities. And actually, they first started coming to me. And then I realized that there was an opportunity to tap into the leaders and the connectors in all of these different cities and say, let's build a chapter in Toronto. Let's build a chapter in Boston. And we started doing the same thing, dinners and connecting people. And all of a sudden, there was this ethos that connected all of us. And that's why the call I had before this was with my VP of product. And, we have our digital platform that 100% of our members will be on by the end of the summer. But I hired my VP of product a year and a half ago. And, this shit takes a long time to build. But what's the point? The point is that we had technology beforehand, but those technology was encoded in our values. That was the technology. To the extent that technology is tools, systems, process that help you replicate common behavior at scale, the thing that helped us do that was the values of Pavilion, the values of helping other people, looking to offer assistance, looking to give before you get. And that connected with people, coupled with our point of view, and coupled with this idea that we would tap into local leaders and have them help us build the communities in those chapters. And all of that came together really through last year. And then, and then you reach this inflection point. And the last thing I'll say is for all the entrepreneurs and founders out there, through in a zero interest rate environment where companies are waving money at you, and I felt like I was a genius, people would say, what do you regret? And I would say, I don't regret anything. Everything I did led me to this place, and I'm so grateful for every experience. That was a year ago. Today, I don't say that. Today, I have many specific and direct regrets. And those regrets are all tied to trying to figure out, how do you scale this thing? And like, what do you do? And what's the decision-making process? And how do you collect information? And we made a bunch of mistakes. And one of the mistakes we made was we got rid of chapters last year. We got rid of chapters, these local city chapters, because we were paying $3 million a year out to the chapter heads, and it felt unsustainable. But what I didn't understand was that you can renegotiate those deals without throwing out the entire structure. So we took a bunch of actions that really, we were trying to find the right formula for continuing to grow at scale. And it's always hard to do within a community. And that's still the journey that we're on, to be honest with you, is trying to figure out what is valuable to people right now, and how do we deliver that value so that it's worth the money, so that they feel proud and good about contributing.
That's super interesting. And I almost feel like sometimes I feel like the guy in that movie Memento, it's always like who's lost his memory and he's tattooing things that he needs to know. Like, I am this guy.
Sammy
Jenkins, right? And it's like, oh yeah, this is the thing people value. This is why people come to us. This is the thing that works. And you kind of forget that, and you go on these side missions or whatever. At least I do, and then come back to it again. So I guess with that, like, how have you gone about finding what people value? What has that been for you, and what's kind of immutable about that for what you're doing?
Well, I think what you just said is so true, which is that I've written about this, I get bored maybe, or I feel like a need to change things, and you don't need to change as much as you think. Most of what we're doing right now at Pavilion is trying to go back to the way that things used to be a couple years ago, because we went wide and we got unfocused. That had an impact on people's perception of us. Now, there's still lots of people that love us, but there's more people that don't love us today than there were a couple of years ago. So for me, it's about just trying to, you ask, right? You ask for feedback, you try to listen to that feedback. And then for me, again, it's about like, what is repeatable, right? So the problem with community is that it is pretty hard to repeat, right? It's hard. It becomes bigger. People feel that it's getting bigger. And I'm not Noah Tepperberg, I'm not the guy that started Soho House. Like, I'm not going to build the coolest club in town. And even the coolest club in town becomes not the coolest club in town over time. I am focused on delivering value. So for me, what we've discovered is that learning, it's a scalable entry point. That's what I will say. What has emerged from me? So we built this thing, Pavilion University. It's just a series of online courses that teach people all the stuff that I'm talking about: how to be a chief revenue officer, how to be a chief marketing officer. It's all led by excellent and amazing members of the community. Last year, we had 12,000 total enrollments and 6,000 unique students. We've had probably 5,000 already this year, unique students. And so, we're going to probably double the number of unique students that happen in 2023. And a lot of people, by the way, say, I didn't join Pavilion to take a class. I understand that, but a class is tangible value that I can deliver. We're going to pursue accreditation so that your classes can be accredited and you can apply them to college credits or postgraduate credits and get a degree. And that for me is the way to drive that is scalable. I know how to create courses. I know how to make them good. And I know that we're going to teach people stuff they can't learn anywhere else. And then you're going to come for the content, you're going to come for the skills, and you're going to stay for the community. But scaling community as a value proposition is actually pretty hard. It's hard to build a landing page that converts really, really well, unless it's just you've talked to a bunch of friends in Dynamite Group or whatever it's called, and you're just like, I got to do this thing. They got a meeting next week and I want to go to it. But otherwise, it's a little amorphous. Why do I need this right now? Aside from the fact that maybe you just got fired or something like that. And that's why content and sort of courses and skill development is the way that you get people in. And then what you try to do is give them the warm embrace of peer groups to show them how powerful community can be.
That's really interesting. I mean, in talking about scaling community being really difficult, it's funny because if you were going to scale, if you wanted to grow, 9-figure $1 billion tech company, you'd probably look at Amazon or IBM or whatever. And it seems like if you wanted to use that same mental model and you wanted to scale a community, which is really hard, you'd look at the longest lasting communities which have been there, which are religions, right? How do you feel about that? Do you draw inspiration from what religions have done? And then that can go in really dark directions because then you have cults, right? And and then you have people like Peter Thiel to talk about how all great startups veer into cultishness, and that's just like a byproduct that you have to deal with. How do you feel about that?
I think it's a great point. I haven't thought about that recently, connecting it to religion, but I think you're right. Which it's sort of my first point about point of view. Like religions have a point of view on the world, and I guess the other part that you would say is religions purport to have answers to difficult questions that might induce anxiety in you in the absence of those answers, and they give you a sense of purpose. And they also are willing to take a long time. I
Yeah.
think that's probably, for me, like that's why we want to be profitable. Last year we were unprofitable, and now we are profitable. And being profitable is a wonderful thing because I don't need to sell this thing tomorrow or the day after or any particular day, right? If I'm profitable, I can exist forever, and I can take as long as I can live within my means personally, and the company can live within its means. We can do this for as long as it takes. And that is the freedom to help us focus on our members and making sure that we're building something of value. But I guess to the point of religion, you're right that, it's not just Peter Thiel, another Thiel disciple, David Sachs, talks about your startup is a mission. So I think there's something to that. I think that's why all of this content creation companies, that all starts with, what do you believe about the world that other people don't believe? That's where
Yeah.
it starts. And then
Yeah.
you can project that belief out into the universe, and the people that believe it will come calling to you.
Yeah, and I think it takes a lot of time and introspection and experience to answer that question. It's not something you just sit around and come up with, because usually what people will do is just come up with some controversial opinion, or they'll just take one side of a controversy, right? So
No, you're right. It's a messaging exercise of what, and then you have to just be mindful because, again, like social media, the incentives of social media reward being an asshole, or just being doctrinaire, right? Being very confident in a controversial opinion without a lot of nuance, subtlety, or complexity. And that might reward you. And then you got to just figure out, am I that person? Do I really believe those things, or am I saying them to get attention? Because the thing that's scalable is if you really believe them, and the thing that's not scalable is if you're just constantly trying to incite outrage or controversy.
yeah, and let's dig into that a little bit, or maybe go kind of riff on that. And you talk a lot about values, and I think that for me personally, and for others I know, like values are something, they don't change every day, but they do change, maybe over the course of years or whatever. But what's your opinion of that? Like, how often do you think personal values change? How do you know when they're changing? And then how does that affect things on a business level, or in terms of the values you would have with Pavilion, on a macro level?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think it requires introspection. I hope they don't change too much, but you're right that they do change a little bit. We have a value within Pavilion: listen closely, act quickly. And the purpose of that value is to say, listen to the members, they'll tell you what to do, and then be decisive in acting upon their feedback. And that value has gotten us in some trouble because sometimes we're making decisions a little bit impulsively without the right level of data or design. And when you got 10,000 members, this, human cognition is an imperfect thing, as Danny Kahneman and Tversky and all these people that have studied human behavior will tell us, and Robert Cialdini, they'll tell us that we don't really understand a lot about the world, and some of our mental models don't really work. And one of the things that my mental model doesn't really work with is sort of degrees of nuance, right? And I'm a binary kind of person. It's working, it's not working, it's broken, or it's fixed. And so you forget as you grow that a thing can be quote unquote broken if 51% of people don't like it, but that still leaves 49% of people that do. And a thing can be, and 15%, and the difference between 40% and 15% is very significant, very significant. And you sometimes don't realize that you're operating at that scale because you're used to operating with 100 people, where if 2 people don't like it, you can just give them a phone call and say, I'm sorry, you don't like it, what can we do? Whereas at 10,000 people, that might be 200 people or 1,000 people that don't like what you've done or a change that you've made. So then we're thinking about swapping out that value, listen closely, act quickly, for design, test, build, because we want to be, more intentional about the decisions that we make. So, you know what? I think it just requires some level of introspection. I mean, exactly to the point of your question, right? The first name of the company was Revenue Collective, and we changed it to Pavilion 2 years ago. Now, why did we change it? That upset some people. We changed it because I felt like the word collective wasn't where I was at anymore. Collective was us versus them. It was band of brothers. It was the guild. It was the union. It was there's the man. We got to fight the man. We're going to band together so we can fight the man and, collective bargaining, organized labor, that kind of deal. And I mean, that's not what the word literally means, but that's what it evoked for me. That's not where I was at. That's not where I am at. I'm not against anybody these days. I am for everybody achieving whatever it is they want to achieve. That doesn't mean get taken advantage of. That still means try to be fair and good and compassionate. But that's why we changed the name to Pavilion, because Pavilion feels to me like a bigger idea. It's not about us versus them. It's about everybody achieving their best version of themselves. It's a long-winded, rambling, and not super specific answer to your question, but I think the shortest answer is it requires constant introspection and evaluation. And that's how you do it. And then you just try to communicate.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And right now, there's kind of like a blood in the streets feeling, mass layoffs, et cetera, et cetera. With that in mind, I guess like what's life like on the ground at Pavilion for people in these VP roles and so on? Like, what are some of the issues you guys are working through?
So blood on the streets is correct. And, I have two answers to that question because this has been on my mind. The first answer for our members is that the tech economy has taken a massive hit, and the global economy is not in a recession based on the data that we can see. And we got a good inflation print today that we're recording this, on May, whatever, 10th, and good April jobs report, right? Like the US is not in a recession, but the tech economy is in a recession. And more importantly, the structure of the tech economy has become unbalanced. What do I mean by that? I mean that valuations are out of alignment with the stated previous valuations of companies is out of alignment with how much they're really worth today in a pretty sizable and fundamental way. And that creates many, many downstream impacts and effects. It has reduced the desirability of working at a startup, because if you're working at a company that's worth $500 million based on their last financing round, but is only doing $3 million in revenue and is actually worth probably $40 million today, not 500, you have to think about what that means for how long you want to work at that company and how you're structuring your life. And it also means that the companies themselves have to reorient, because there was a growth at any cost, go idea 2 years ago. And that isn't going to work. And it's not going to work because you're going to spend more than you make. I was talking to a friend of mine who's CRO at a company doing 7 million in revenue, and they burned $23 million last year. 7 million in revenue. They spent $23 million more than they made last year. That is not a company, right? That's not, I mean, it's a company if money is completely free and everybody's willing to believe whatever you want to sell them. But in most environments, that's not a company. And so what does that person do? Well, what that person is doing is they're selling that company and basically liquidating it. And that person is leaving that company to find something new. So there's this massive reset that's happening and reordering, which is really overwhelming and can create a lot of uncertainty. And there's layoffs and there's legal negotiations and there's severance negotiations. So that's what's happening within the membership. And all of that stress and anxiety is flowing through to everything everybody does, including how they pay their bills. And so within Pavilion, the company, there's also blood on the streets to a certain extent, because people's expectations about I've gotten more refund requests and more people saying, I missed the renewal. And we're like, we sent you 3 reminders and it was a month ago. And you're like looking at your credit card statement a month later and you want us to refund the money, and it doesn't feel fair on our end. And they're like, well, I'm going to blow you up on social media and I'm going to go throw a temper tantrum and I'm going to go jump and shout in the street. People are under a lot of stress, I guess is what I would say. And people are acting out. It's the reality of the world. What's my advice? My advice is, as my family would say when I was growing up, suck it up. Like we gotta be optimistic. We gotta accept our role in these outcomes and our agency in these outcomes. And I don't think now is the time to be a victim and to blame everybody else for all of the problems that have befallen us. I think now is the time to try and retain our compassion, our decency, and our optimism, and look to help other people and support each other, and know that this too shall pass, that economies are cyclical. And, like I said, I was telling my wife this morning, right? 4.9% inflation, which was this morning's number, down from a high of like 9% a couple months ago. means that interest rates might come down in the second half of the year, or at least in the beginning of 2024. Good times are ahead. Economic growth is ahead, but we just got to make it through, and we got to retain our dignity in so doing.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I guess with that, if you get to see a lot of data for where people are at and kind of different roles of their careers, mid-career, later, et cetera, what's the sort of, and maybe it's not just from you personally, but what's the sort of advice or ideal advice that's being given to those people, maybe in a mid-career role that have been laid off, or maybe even just like entering the workforce? Like where do you think the opportunity lives? What can they expect? I think we heard a lot from in the COVID era about how everyone's going to have this kind of like mercenary, location independent work life. Do you see that being the case? Do you think we go back to a more traditional, longer term thing? Like how do you
No,
feel about all that?
I think AI is going to accelerate everything that happened during COVID. And I think that we are not going back to legacy institutions that employ us for long periods of time. I think volatility and uncertainty will increase. I think that means there's going to be tons of opportunity. I think it means that, Dan, if you're starting a business and you wanted to build a website and build an app, you used to have to pay a bunch of money to a web development agency, and you're going to have to pay less money to that agency, or you're going to build it yourself using AI and maybe one other engineer. I think stuff that used to take 10 people will take 3 people. Stuff that used to take 200 people is going to take 30 people. And I think that that's deflationary in the short term and a big opportunity in the long term. And, 10 years ago, there was no such thing as an influencer, and nobody could make money posting pictures of themselves on Instagram. And I'm not here to say that that's a bad thing. That's actually pretty cool, that there's all of these different types of creators, and there's personal fitness creators. These guys I follow on Twitter that are telling me I got to do a bear hanging. I got to like hang from the bar for 60 seconds, and that'll determine if I live a long time or not. Like there's all of these niche interests that may be able to create some kind of living for some people, but I think it's going to be tremendously uncertain. I think there's going to be more and more and more disruption, because AI is going to be able to do stuff not that the best people can do, but that your most mediocre people can do. And we've all employed a lot of mediocrity in our life and worked with a lot of mediocrity. And so what happens to those mediocre people? I don't know. I think probably universal basic income gets raised again and again and again, because I think there's not going to, but maybe I'm just being too pessimistic. I think there's always going to be jobs and opportunity for truly interesting, unique, creative, authentic people, or at least there will be for the next 10 years. But there will not be opportunity for less interesting people.
I definitely agree. I think the thing that's really hard to figure out is time horizons and how fast it all moves, and how fast status quo can change, and that sort of thing. So that's the hard thing to pinpoint. And I think, kind of getting towards the end of our time, I sort of buried one of the bigger concepts that you focus on, which is the idea of kindness and reciprocity and so on. And I guess one question I have is, what's your experience with that? Like, do you have any stories about what reciprocity means to you in your career, and kind of how that's played out and helped you build what you've built so far?
Yeah, I mean, I just think for a long time, I'm a connector, and I like connecting people. And I don't mean this in a weird way. I don't like talking to them that much, but I like making them happy in a weird way. I like the puzzle pieces of so-and-so is looking for a job, and I have a profile in them of my head, and I say, you know what, you should talk to this person. And I make that connection, and they end up working together. So for me, I also think, which I write about in the book, that everybody that does a thing wants to immediately send you a bill for doing that thing. And you can look different. You can stand out in the world by not sending a bill right away. You can look different by helping other people and just trusting that it'll come back to you some other way. And I think that the more you can behave like that, the happier that you'll be. And my point of my book is, it is a path to success. It may take longer than tomorrow. It's not a path to success by Friday. It's a path to success over 5 to 10 years. If you consistently help other people and make connections between people and help people find upside, and don't count all of the shekels that are related to like somebody winning slightly more than you or losing slightly less than you. My experience is that when I've done those things and focused on those things, that's when good things happen.
Yeah, mine too. And I also think that when times are tough or like the chips are down, et cetera, it's the solve for that, right? Because you can really get into a spiral of I need to figure out how to make money, I need to go sell, I need to like not have people waste my time, and then that just is poisonous. So it really is.
Every
Yeah.
time I've been in exactly that mindset of like, I got to go find some way to make money tomorrow. Let me figure out what schemes and scams and, what little systems I can build. It's never worked out. And the times that I have made money, it's because I wasn't thinking about money, didn't give a shit about money, and then money showed up.
Yeah, exactly. So there's some sort of order to the universe, maybe. At least one
I
could
think
hope.
so. That's the
Yeah.
point of the book.
Yeah, exactly. So, Sam, this has been so much fun. Where can people go to see what you're up to, get in touch, all
You
that
can
good
find
stuff?
me on
Yeah.
LinkedIn. I write a lot on LinkedIn. So my name is Sam Jacobs, CEO Pavilion. You can, of course, go to my website, joinpavilion.com. You can buy the book Kind Folks Finish First on Amazon. You can send me an email, sam@joinpavilion.com. I live at the corner of 7th Avenue and 11th Street. You can hang out there and bang some pots and pans, and I'll come down and ask you to stop, and we can get in an argument on the street and then be friends after that.
That sounds great. Or you do the John Cusack say anything boombox
Yeah,
kind of
exactly.
deal.
Just,
Yeah.
you ever think about how creepy and weird that is? They'd
Yeah.
broken up, and he's standing out like that's stalking. That's what that is.
Yeah. In the 80s, I guess it wasn't, so you
Well,
a
it's like a
different
different
era.
world, pre-Me Too. Like men could do whatever they wanted. It was viewed as like cute and
Yeah.
endearing. When I'm like standing outside someone's window when they
Yeah.
ask me to not see them anymore. But
Th- th-
anyway, that's
Let's stop it for
a
another
topic
day.
for different.
But
Yeah,
but yeah,
exactly.
I will say those John Hughes movies. I don't know if that was John Hughes, but it's of
It
that
was
era.
Cameron Crowe. It was
Cameron
Cameron
Crowe.
Crowe's.
Okay, cool.
I
Yeah,
think his
and
second movie.
I think
Yeah.
I'm a little younger than that, but I know people that those sorts of movies kind of ruined their love lives for years, and just the expectations those movies set.
Oh my God, I wanted to be Lloyd Dobler so badly.
Yeah, yeah, I've heard a
So
lot of that.
anyway,
So
yeah.
anyway, Sam, this has been great. We'll get all that linked up, and hope we can do it again soon.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Great chatting with you.
Likewise.